Thank you, Wendell. Good evening, viewers, and welcome to tonight's regional newscast. We commence in Jamaica. The tourism sector says its expectation for an uptick in visitor arrivals this winter season have been tempered by the Level 4 classification imposed in Jamaica by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention (CDC). The United States Centers for Disease Control has issued warning to Americans to avoid traveling to Jamaica. To this extent, the president of the Jamaica Hotel and Tourist Association, Clifton Reeder, has stated, and I quote, "It is something that is basically telling visitors not to come to Jamaica, and by virtue of that, it must have some negative impact on our arrivals going into the winter season now," end of quote. The United States government-led public health agency late last week included Jamaica on a list of more than 180 countries to which Americans should avoid travel if possible, and if they do, to take extra precautions, including testing before departure, wearing masks, and practicing social distancing, among other recommendations. Reeder expressed disappointment that the Level 4 classification will also negatively impact the traditional boost in visitor arrivals over the American Thanksgiving holiday. Reeder was hopeful that the CDC would reduce the classification if the number of new COVID cases on the island continues to decrease. Among the other countries listed as high risk are Antigua and Barbuda, Trinidad and Tobago, the Bahamas, and the Turks and Caicos Islands. In Belize, Prime Minister of Belize, John Briceno, has tested positive for COVID-19. In a statement late Monday, the Office of the Prime Minister said that the newly appointed Prime Minister was recently swabbed for the virus. I quote, "Prime Minister Briceno will remain in isolation for the next 2 weeks, after which he will be retested," end of quote, the statement said. Earlier this month, Briceno led the People's United Party to victory in the general election. Following news of the Prime Minister's diagnosis, the Office of the Prime Minister issued a reminder urging the public to continue to wear masks, practice social distancing, and to follow the guidelines of the Ministry of Health. We now turn our attention to Venezuela. Self-declared Venezuela interim president Juan Guaido has lambasted Trinidad and Tobago's deportation of 16 Venezuelan children, describing it as, and I quote, "cruel, painful, and inhumane," end of quote. The deportation has sparked outrage on social media, with hundreds of persons condemning the move to deport the children, the majority of whom are under 10 years of age. Guaido has started the hashtag #WhereAreThe16 as the pirogue transporting the children back to Venezuela is yet to be located. The English translation of his tweet read, and I quote, "The cruel treatment to which they subject Venezuelans who have been forced to migrate as a result of the dictatorship is painful and inhumane. Parliament will initiate an investigation and the world is watching the events in Trinidad and Tobago. #WhereAreThe16, end of quote," the tweet read. And finally, for some international news, U.S. President-elect Joe Biden on Tuesday began a new phase in his transition to the White House after Trump's administration gave the Democrat access to critical resources that will enable him to take the reins of the power in January. The General Services Administration's announcement on Monday that it would formally recognize Biden's transition came after weeks of the president falsely claiming that the November 3 election had been marred by widespread voter fraud. Trump, in a post on Twitter, offered support for the move. Critics have said the president's refusal to accept the results undermined U.S. democracy and undercut the next administration's ability to fight the novel coronavirus. While Trump stopped short of conceding, it was the closest he had come to acknowledging that it is time to hand over power to Biden, who will take office on January 20. The General Service Administration announcement will allow the president-elect to access millions of dollars in funds and focus on putting together a leadership team. It also paves the way for Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris to receive regular national security briefings that Trump also gets. And that concludes tonight's regional news. Thank you so much for joining. Back to you, Wendell.